Welcome to the Creating Kinder Content podcast. Today, I am joined by the Australian member of Legislative Council, Shadow Minister for Planning and Public Spaces, Shadow Minister for Housing, Shadow Minister for Cities, and Shadow Minister for the Hunter and Central Coast, the Honorable Scott Glenn Farlow. He's constantly doing his inner work, and the number one thing that resonates with me most about Scott is the fact that he is a listener. He works towards considered consciousness as a decision maker in politics, which sometimes goes against his own preconceptions and understands and recognizes the need to put aside ideologies that have always existed through popular narrative with the world that we're growing in today, making sure that at least everyone is heard, but is considered to grow at large together. He is a firm believer that life is not to be one based on unilateral decisions. And the key to that, he says, is being open to learning, unlearning, accepting, and most importantly, taking accountability, especially towards things that you're committed to. Because if you're committed to something, you will have to go through the whole process, which will require for you to be open to being more accepting of what is and what can be, and then succeeding at it. But then, even when you succeed at it, Scott thinks you should always be open to finding more ways to being better at what you've already succeeded at. Scott, it is an absolute pleasure and an honor to have you on the Creating Kinder Content podcast. And without any further ado, can I please request you to firstly introduce yourself in 3 words that you think best describe you to my audience to begin with?
Look, inquisitive is the first one that I choose. In a sense, ever since I was a little kid, I grew up in asking why questions and never being content with the answer just ending there and asking why. And I guess that's continued throughout my life. I'm always asking why. Why are things the way that they are? Can they be better? And not just taking any answer for granted and trying to interrogate that. So that may make me a little annoying to some in continuing to ask that question of why, but why does it have to be? But it's fundamentally part of who I am. Determined is the next one. I think that my grandmother, when I was a child, always used to say I could wrap her around my little finger, in a sense, in being able to get her to do certain things. But I've always been pretty focused in terms of what I want to achieve, and being able to get an outcome. And that's certainly something that's continued on through my life, and being focused on where I want to go and the outcomes that I want to see achieved. And lastly, I think it would be reasonable. And I think there's a whole lot of, everyone thinks they're a reasonable person in a sense. And I would I don't want to add a fourth word to this, but I was tossing up between reasonable and stable. But I think it sort of falls more to reasonable in the sense of being able to see the world from different perspectives and appreciate what other people's perspectives are. And I think that's fundamentally part of being reasonable, is to understand that people come from different worldviews, people come from different experiences, and being able to work with that and through that, and not to expect that everybody shares your worldview. Everyone is formed in a different way, a different background, a different upbringing, and has a different outlook. And by being reasonable, in a sense, it's being able to appreciate that and to be able to work with that, and still try to be able to make everything function.
I love that. I think those 3 words are great. And I think it also sums up my introduction for you, because that's exactly what I was talking about. The fact that I definitely think you're stable, and I will give you your first word on wise, because I think it is because of who you are that I think the first time you and I met in a political setup, I remember you were the first person who had answers to all my whys, and you were very patient, and you were listening to me, and you allowed me that space to grow and make me actually realize that politics is actually kindness. It's about empathy, it's about considering other people, it's about respecting their views, and finding the best way forward. It isn't necessarily unilateral, and I think that's one of the reasons that you're on this podcast. And thank you for being honest, and I'll 100% give you stable,
Thank you,
because I
Mallika.
think I will identify you with stable, and the other things, and then of course also being open. But the 3 words, before we get into the core of the podcast, are these words that, like you said, your grandmom had a contribution, but are these words that you have heard about while you were growing up as core essentials a human being should have? Or are these things that you have learned also by being who you are? And I know for a fact that you've also been a public person for a very long time because you were mayor at 23. So you've had a longish working life for a very young
Yeah.
person. Where are these words coming from?
Well, look, I think everything is formative in a sense. And I look at my own kids now and their characteristics. And my son's 10 and my daughter's 8. And I've seen a lot of their characteristics from when they were like babies. And I'm talking like incredibly little babies where you sort of see things that emerge and develop from them. And you go, okay, that's the iteration of what they were like at 12 months when they were crying in this way over this thing. Now it manifests itself in something different. It might be that's how they, my son, for instance, that's how he will manipulate certain things. As my wife pointed out to my son the other day when I gave my daughter something, he's like, well, look at how she asks for that compared to how you do. She's outlined this whole condition in terms of, oh, but Dad, this would be better. And whereas my son will just say, I want this. And you sort of see in many ways that we're all sort of formed when we're very young, and then how we develop through life. Of course, things change, our outlooks change, our experiences shape us. But there's a certain inherent characteristic of all of us that's always there from a really young age, and I've often seen in sort of the nature and nurture debate, and as to how people are formed. And it very much is nature, where you've got brothers and sisters, or even in some cases, I've got nieces of mine who are identical twins, and they are incredibly different people because, and even though they were born in exactly the same way, they've had pretty much the same experiences through life, but there's something inherently different in each of them, and inherently different in each of us, and that forms the core of who we are.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I love the way you've answered that because it obviously sort of highlights the fact that there's so much to nature and nurture together, but there's also like how someone has been accepted, I think, at any age, or has been allowed to be considered, or have they been heard, have they been addressed? And I think it's something that carries on as we grow up. And I think, yeah, that is really important. And therefore, my next question, Scott, you have spoken really beautifully about your beautiful family, but has there been any act of kindness that you remember? I'm sure there's been a few with the kind of person that you are. You're projecting the kindness, and so I'm assuming it's come to you. But is there any act of kindness that you remember which sort of was transformational for you because you were like, oh my God, like I can be made to feel this way. I want everyone to feel this way. And would you like to share that with us?
I'm actually going to choose an example which is not necessarily a transformational early example, but one in politics, so to speak. So when I first started out in, I won't say my political career, but when I first started out in state parliament, one of the first things I did was in conjunction with Anzac Day in Australia, which is effectively our day of commemorating our war veterans in Australia. And the event that I was at was with a member of the opposition who, funnily enough, ended up becoming the leader of the opposition and now actually chairs the Australia India Business Council, Jody Mackay. And there was something that I was not familiar with at the time, which was that there were actually two commemorations occurring at the same time. There was one that was going to be a usual cenotaph service, so to speak, and there was another that was a dedication. So in that, you needed two wreaths to be able to dedicate. And so I'd only brought one along. And this was an example where I could have looked really stupid. I was really vulnerable going, what will I do? And Jody showed me an immense act of kindness, being my political adversary, in saying, for the second commemoration, why don't you come up with me and we'll do it together? She didn't need to do that. It's something that wouldn't have been necessarily to her political advantage, but was a really great act of kindness. And I want to tell that story in a sense, not just to say what a great person Jody is, but to also show when it comes to politics, it's not all nastiness necessarily. And there are many kindnesses along the way that you find from your political opponents, so to speak. And that's something that I've always been quite mindful of politically as well. of even though we might have a fairly adversarial process in competition and we're competing for votes, we're competing with our worldviews, there are plenty of opportunities to show kindness along the way to your fellow colleagues. And it's one of the untold stories often when people find themselves in political trouble or scandal. It's often members from the other side who will actually reach out and check in on your mental health and how you're doing as a person. So it can be quite surprising in that sense, and I've certainly seen examples of that, and been part of it myself as well in reaching out to some of my political opponents, but when they've been down and just checking on them and seeing how they are.
Wow, wow. I'm actually very overwhelmed hearing this, and I'm so grateful that you've had that experience. And thank you for sharing it because I think when we hear about politics or any kind of news that comes to us, whichever genre we're in, but especially because you're from the political background, I think globally the news that reaches us, and it could be any world, any country, any part of the world that we come from, I think more often than not that the news that reaches us about politics, which becomes a problem eventually because it ceases to function as means of effective governance, or it starts to negatively impact people because then you're sort of correlating politicians with corruption or erosion of democratic principles, polarization, lack of representation, those kind of things, or like even abuse of power. But I think the fact that you've had that experience from someone in the opposition, the fact that that happens, and then therefore when you were talking to me, I remember you said, no, it's supposed to be political engagement and governance, and empathy is important and consideration is
Mm.
important, and you should listen to what your opposition is saying. You, like you said, you check up on why they're saying it, because at the end of the day, if politics is done right, which I think you have taught me, which a lot of our own counterparts in India, your counterparts in India have taught me, is about public service. It's about policy knowledge and communication and accountability and making sure that you're listening to everyone and representing the voice at large. So thank you so much for sharing that story, and I hope
Thank you,
that the
Malika.
younger politicians can learn from this experience. In your opinion, then, from the experiences that you have, do you reckon kindness then affects, of course it impacts the well-being of someone who is being impacted by the kindness, but do you think it's also a two-way street? It impacts the well-being and the happiness for someone who is being kind, or do you think it has nothing for the person who's doing the act?
Oh, look, I think kindness is something that works for both the giver and the receiver in terms of being kind, because it changes your outlook as well in terms of being able to show kindness, that you have a different view of the world. You have a different view as to how things should be, and it makes you happier, so to speak, in being kind, particularly when you feel appreciated for that kindness as well, and you feel that warmth and that joy that is shown in kindness. And there are so many people throughout India and Australia who do remarkable things for very little appreciation, very little reward, and they do it out of the goodness of their heart, and they are better people for it. And I think our society is so much better for it as well.
Absolutely. I think I'm glad that you also brought that relationship in, because it is really imperative. I think the government now is working towards undoing anything that was said in the past as well. And I think that chapter should have rested because it was misinformation. But I think India and Australia are natural friends and we're allies and we value each other. We really respect each other's cultures. We've learned so much given our own histories and, wanting to become better. And I think that particular space makes us do what we're doing today, because I've received so much kindness in Australia and you were here, and I think we were kind to you as well. And so
Yes,
moving
indeed.
to therefore the next question is, then do you think kindness plays a role in fostering a sense of connection or connectivity or community in this increasingly interconnected yet very interpersonal world that we live in?
Well, I think it does, but I think there is some dangers to that as well in terms of our connected world and being behind phones all the time. That we are maybe a little bit more disconnected than we were when it comes to kindness and what we're able to do. And kindness doesn't seem to live online as much as what it does in the
Yes.
community and interpersonal relationships. And that I think is a challenge for us in terms of how we're able to reduce it to whether it be the 15-second video clips or whether it be the 120 characters, that kindness has got to live there too. And I think we have struggled with that. And as our social media has developed, it has created somewhat of a poisonous environment online. And I think that's at odds to what there actually exists in reality. And as a politician, I'll say as well that it's rare that you will have people who will berate you in a one-on-one personal communication. They might express their frustrations or the like, but they're rare to come up in the same way that they would online, in with the same sort of vitriol online. And it sort of makes good sport online, so to speak, to be the nastiest person in the room. Whereas if you're walking down the street, nobody wants to be near the nastiest person.
Yeah.
So I think that is one of the challenges that we do need to face as we have a wonderful connected world with such great things like this, but we've also, and I'm sure your podcast is part of that as well, in terms of bringing that kindness online and through the digital world, because we've got so much to gain from, we've got so much to gain by being connected to people on the other side of the world, reducing the size of the world, and being able to have comfortable conversations. Yet we also have the peril that we can have a world that's more divided as we get closer together online, because kindness just doesn't live there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's sad that we've had the experiences we've had, and I think when you and I have also discussed this, I think when you were in India, when I was in Australia, we've had this question of, are the Australians racist? I'm not going to get into the details, but I think it was lack of representation. I think it was spread of misinformation. I was in Australia when the event was happening, and I've almost become the poster child of, but are the Australians racist? And I'm like, no, you were lied to. Bad things happen everywhere, and I think the fact that that hasn't left social media is becoming one of the biggest narratives, which you can't undo because it's now on the digital platform. But I think the fact that we're working towards bringing our faces, which is why this podcast is important, to remind people that this isn't about something that you can undo, because the truth is not online. But we're trying to change that with this podcast, and
Yeah.
thank you for, of course, your time. No, but so then therefore I think my next question, before we get into the kindness quick starts, which is the funner section, I wanted to ask: in this world that you're in the political space that you're in, the younger people who are coming in, has there ever been acts of unkindness that you think could have been dealt with differently from your experience? Because there are people who are looking up to joining politics now. I think with younger people like yourself coming in, you've inspired so many other younger people to come in at the right time so that they have a longer time to make the impact. What are your words of advice for those people who are stepping in now and will, of course, receive unkindness? How do you get past that?
Well, look, unfortunately, there is a certain nature of politics which is rough and tumble as well. And that sadly is, I don't think, going to change anytime soon. And often there will be people who come in and say they're going to change the system and don't, and
Yeah.
find themselves falling into the same traps again and again. So I think in many ways you do need to be resilient as well, in politics, and to understand sort of the rough and tumble nature of politics. But in the same sense, that doesn't have to be personal. We can have different opposing views on certain issues, but it doesn't have to go to the core of who you are as a person, and that people are good or bad people. People just have different worldviews, and they may not accord with your worldviews. But I find 99% of people who are in politics are usually there for the right reasons. They just may have a different reason, to me, as to being there. And in the same sense, I think that when it comes to people who are young, particularly getting involved, the best things are the small acts of kindness from people to make them feel more included, to make them feel more comfortable in situations. Because all of us in a new environment find ourselves in an awkward, uncomfortable position, and it's those small interactions, those small bits of kindness, the fleeting conversations where somebody makes you feel welcome or brings you into a conversation or gives you some advice, and often gives you advice when you do something wrong rather than just letting you continue doing the wrong thing. That can be the greatest help. And I've found that certainly along my pathway, that there's certainly been some negatives that I've encountered, definitely a lot of acts of unkindness. But certainly the most encouraging thing has been when people have shown you those small acts of kindness and those small elements where you actually do feel that little bit better about yourself as well. And I think that's great for young people coming in to be able to be embraced in that system as well. So, and I've got to say, Malika, now I'm middle aged, so I don't feel myself as being young. And as you said, I've had quite a long period in public life. So
For
I've
everybody,
nearly
he's,
spent.
I'm sorry to cut you short. For everybody, he feels like he's old now or not very young. He's only 40. He started at 20. He's been working too long. And so, of course, that is making you feel the way you're feeling. But yeah, the wisdom
Well,
is,
I've had about 20 years in public life now, so
yeah,
it's yeah, it's been a fair stint when I look back at it. So
you still fall in the young category. So let's just have you take the credit because you're making it look good. But I think with the wisdom that you have, and I think that's one of the reasons that you're on this podcast is because I think it's so important that people recognize that, like you said, a majority is actually good people, and the stories that come out are actually of the misrepresentation, or people are actually harming the system negatively,
yeah.
and then we think that that's become the way of life, and so we stop trusting people who are actually working this hard, and there are misconceptions and preconceptions and everything that we have because of the narrative that goes around and then never leaves because we're on the digital platforms. I have one question. I know that I said it was the last before we get into the kindness
No,
quarters,
no.
but one question before we get in, also from someone who comes from the outside. You've experienced India. You've been a part of the whole political system. Is there any piece of misinformation that you'd like to break about the two countries that has often gone around through your own experience, because you've actually experienced both countries fairly closely?
Look, I think Australia and India are just two great partners in the world, and the Australian-India relationship is one which is a very strong one. I've got to say, I've got a part of that as well. Like I had family that have come from India to Australia like 150 years ago. To be part of Australia, were born in India, and so there is a shared history, and there's many Australians who have small parts and hidden parts, in a sense, in their life that has been shaped and formed by India, and a world which is a former world and one which we don't want to replicate, but where Australia and India were very much similar dispositions. Like even one of our oldest buildings in Australia, I was visiting recently, and it had photos of what was at the time the Archbishop of Calcutta, because at the time, Parramatta, which was the heart of Australian Federation, or sorry, the Australian Foundation of European settlement in Australia, actually fell under the Diocese of Calcutta.
Yeah,
So there is this rich shared history between our two countries, and now Australia has more than 700,000
we're all over
people of Indian descent who are part of our community in Australia and part of our 26 million strong country. So you're looking at about between 3 to 4% of Australia, which is of Indian descent, and that is growing significantly. I'm sure when we get to our next census, that figure will be over 1 million.
yeah.
And although those figures in Indian numbers are very small, but in Australian numbers, they are huge. And so, and we are a very harmonious society in Australia, a very multicultural society. And our country has been built from, of course, the first and original inhabitants with the Aboriginal people, then the successive waves of European, British initially, and then later European, whether it be Italian, Greek, or Middle European immigration, and then more recently with Asian migration, particularly from China, Southeast Asia, and India. And they're all part of the Australian story, and largely they all live very harmoniously together in our society. And that's something I'm very grateful of. And I know that when it comes to India, and my experience in India as well, is that India is a harmonious society as well, multi multi-religious society, where largely people are respectful of others' religions, and it's cooperation. And what I see in India as well is a great hope for the world into the future, and that India will continue its rise. And I very much hope that Australia will be part of that story as well.
No, 100%, 100%. I think your family, you are family, but I'm saying the Australians are family. And I think, like you said, we're a large population. So yes, the numbers are small when we think about us in Australia, but we are the largest living human society, if not for the partition in living memory. But I think the fact that this is happening, and I think it's also credit where it's due. I think when I was in Australia, I was made to feel at home. I think for me, Australia is my second home, and like you said, I think we're coming from a race of people who honestly believe, and I think that's something the government is also pressing now, of this one earth, one world, one family, the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. I think we genuinely believe that, and I think the more we believe that, the world will probably become a better place, because I don't think we can differentiate on where we come from, because at the end of it, we're all looking for basics, which is learning how to
Yeah,
live a better life and being kind to each other and considering each other and having that basic respect. So thank you for that. And moving
you're
to
welcome.
our kindness quick start segment, faster answers. You're not allowed to think too long. Are you ready for it?
Okay, this is
Okay.
going to be tough. Yep, I'm
Okay.
getting ready. Do
Okay.
I need
Yeah.
a buzzer for this? Do I need to buzz in or
No buzzer, but just be
no
as
buzzer?
quick
Okay,
as
good.
possible. Don't think too long. All right. And unfortunately, you don't have a hamper, so you're not winning anything.
Ah, nothing to
Yeah.
win.
Nothing to win, but you probably might get some love on the internet. So work really hard for it. What is your go to kindness quote or motto that inspires you?
I think it's do unto others as you'd have done unto yourself, really. Look, I'm a Christian, and that's a fundamental principle of Jesus, and it is a fundamental principle that I think is, no matter your religion, something which is worthwhile living by, and being mindful of others, and really putting yourself in their shoes.
Absolutely, 100%. If kindness had a color, what color would it be and why?
Well, blue is my favorite color, so I'll have to choose blue for kindness. But I think there's something calming about blue. And maybe that's because I have a preference for the ocean and that, and it just, when I see blue, I feel calm, and I find kindness is calm. So,
Amazing. I think you've almost answered my next question, but let's try this. If kindness were a sound, what sound do you think it would make and why?
oh, okay, that one's a little bit harder because the crushing of the ocean and the
Oh, I
waves and
knew
that, I don't think really sort of sums kindness. Maybe it's sort of classical music in a sense, kindness, that sort of soothing classical music that, yeah.
it. Okay. If kindness were food, what sort of food would it be? I need details, flavors, everything, and why.
Okay. It would be a creamy soup, I think, in a sense, because it's one of those things that's easy to go down, where you can sort of taste the salts and spices coming through it, but something that doesn't really take any effort, in a sense.
Mhm. All right, great. Now, my next question is, if kindness were a superpower, what special ability would you like for it to have on you and why?
I think of it in sense of like the superpower of growing, sort of being able
At
to
all?
expand. Because kindness makes you bigger. Kindness makes you bigger. It makes you bigger than who you are necessarily. So that's the superpower I see. Sort of, this sort of magic pill you can have in a sense to grow bigger. And yeah.
Lovely. Now, if you had to choose between having the superpower of being able to make people instantly burst into laughter or making them feel loved and cared for, which one would you choose and why?
I love a laugh, but I think maybe the loved and cared for. I think that's sort of what kindness goes for in many ways, because it just makes you feel at home, and it makes you feel that you're part of it, and that you're safe.
Lovely. All right, my next question. Between the three, men, women, and other gender, which one, how would you rank them in order of kindness?
Oh, this is always very dangerous, but I'd have to rank women first. You've I would say, and look, that goes to sort of, in a sense, the maternal instinct. That very much when I think of kindness, and that I think of my grandmothers and my mother, and that, and so that very much comes to me as sort of, the kindness factor.
Yeah. Okay. And then are we giving the other two a go, or are we just staying politically
I,
correct?
I think I just have to go to women.
All right.
Be
That's
safe.
lovely. Now, since you're a politician, and this is my podcast, I'm the boss. Nobody asks me that question. I have decided to nominate you as my International Kindness Minister. Now, basis
Oh,
that, congratulations, congratulations.
thank you
On
very
that
much. Thank
job
you.
description. But basis that job description, I request you to identify a day or a timeline on what are people doing on this day or timeline, what are people not allowed to do, and what are we calling this particular day or timeline as International Kindness Minister.
International Kindness Minister. Well, I'm going to sort of misappropriate something in a sense. So my children's school actually have, and it was started as a legacy from a girl, Maddie Gladen, who unfortunately passed away from cancer. But they created an award to recognise the kind kid at the school. So when you have your school ceremony at the end of the year, acknowledging, I think they call it their celebration of learning. Not only do they have sort of the ducks and the most academically successful and the most sporting successful, but an award for the kind kid. And that's all about being able to recognise that person who will, stop in the playground, and if somebody falls over, help them picking up. If somebody's alone at lunch, reaching out to them and making them feel part of it. And I love that idea. And I think more of that. So I would like to see sort of that kind kid. We celebrate that with that kind person,
Yeah.
and have that award for the country or the world, who that kind person is. And then also, I think we would celebrate that person. We'd celebrate those acts, and we try to replicate those. Now, on the day you were saying what we can and can't do. Well, I think what we can't do is be negative. We can't be having what we term in Australia having a go at somebody,
Yeah.
and picking on them, or being negative towards them, and trying to have a day of positivity. And I think that'd be nice.
Lovely. And what are we calling this day, the International Kindness Minister?
Oh, the kind person day, I think.
Lovely. No, I love that. I love that, and I think the fact that this is, it is my one of my largest memories of Melbourne. I think, or Victoria, Australia in general. I think they start young with practices like this, and I have never had an Australian not smile in public, not reach out, not ask for help, not give help. And I think it's probably because you start them really young. And so kindness people coming from Australia. But Scott, thank you so much for doing this for us. And before I let
So
you
great to be
go,
with you, Malika.
thank you. Before I let you go, I'm going to appreciate you for the effort you've given in, the transparency, the energy that you've sort of sent in. And it's so that you don't feel depleted. This is your moment to either give us feedback or share a message or ask a question so that I can pour back into your energy that you've spent with us today.
Well, I guess I like the opportunity of being able to ask my own question. Like after being questioned, it's always great to be able to turn the table. So, Malika, for you, what is the kindest act you've ever had that you've received yourself in terms
Well,
of somebody else's kindness towards you?
I think kindness towards me has come to at multiple levels. I think you yourself had changed my perspective on politics, because I remember being absolutely uninterested in this dialogue that we had met. And I was like, why do people have to fight over these things? I think it was a preconception that I had. And you were kind enough to undo it for me. And so now I'm in this place where I'm open, I'm learning, I'm taking accountability for the narratives that are coming my way. And so therefore this podcast. But I think on a larger level, I think the fact that I was this little girl, moved to Australia, was learning how to study the Australian academic system with the Aussies, far away from my house, far away from my family. I couldn't even call them up because the time zone is so different. But I think the fact that every single individual in Australia has given me so much love, so much kindness, is the reason I sit here. And I want to sort of project to the world that it is there, it is possible. You just need to identify the faces and talk more about them, not take them for granted. Which is why the Creating Kinder Content podcast, because I think I owe it to Australia, a large part of it. Yeah, so that's
Well,
from me.
we're very grateful that you've been a part of our country, even briefly, and have been able to take a part of Australia back to India as well.
Absolutely, yeah. But thank you for asking that question, and thank you for your time. And I wish you more kindness coming your way.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Thanks so much, Malika.